Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use this hummingbird and lily die set from Spellbinders, and I'm going to create some die cuts with watercolor cardstock and then watercolor them with Chameleon Mica powder. So my watercolor paper is Spellbinders watercolor paper, and I'm just going to die cut a bunch of die or a bunch of the pieces ahead of time so I have everything ready to go. When I was starting this project, I wasn't sure if I was going to also watercolor the flowers, and in the end I chose to ink blend on them instead to get a little bit of a variation, but I am going to use those Chameleon Mica powders to do the watercoloring on the hummingbirds. The Chameleon Mica powders have some gorgeous shimmer to them, and I think they'll work really, really well for hummingbirds. So I have all the dies that I'm going to use, and I pretty much use every single die in the set. The only ones that I didn't use for this card was the scalloped edge for the clouds, as well as a butterfly die, but I used everything else. And the one thing to note is there is one die set for the wing pieces. You need to die cut that twice to get both wings. So once everything is die cut, or as I'm die cutting, I am taking those die cuts and I'm separating them. So I'm putting all the bird die cuts together, all the leaf die cuts together, and then all the flower die cuts together. That way, when I go to do my coloring, I can make sure that I have everything nice and organized. Now, I couldn't decide what color I wanted my hummingbird to be, so I end up cutting enough pieces to create 2 hummingbirds. I'm only going to use one for this card, but that way when I come to the end, I can pick out my favorite one. So here is just where I'm mentioning or pointing out that you need to cut 2 of those wings for each of the hummingbirds in order to have both of those. So the Chameleon Mica powders that I have are ones that come in a set of 8. There's some beautiful, beautiful colors, and I've already mixed them in with some gum arabic powder to make them watercolors. These Chameleon Mica powders, you couldn't watercolor them on their own. I bought them to use with resin a long time ago, but I love having items that I can use with many different things. So by adding that gum arabic, I can make them into watercolors. So the gum arabic comes in the bottle that you see. You mix 1 part of the gum arabic to 4 parts of the Chameleon Mica powder and mix it together with water, and that creates watercolor. So I only mix them in these little wells here. I didn't use any fancy mills that they use for doing watercolors to make them nice and smooth. So they're a little bit chunky, but they still work perfectly for what I am doing. The Chameleon Mica powders that I have come in a set of 8, like I said, and I used all but one. The only one that I didn't use was the gold one. There are many different colors in here, and I just chose ones that I thought would work well for hummingbirds. And I like to mix them together so I get some color variation. Now I put my pieces onto my grip mat for the watercoloring, but you can see that it doesn't want to grip it as I am doing the watercoloring. So I end up holding some of those pieces down, and where I'm holding them down are where other pieces are going to be glued on top of it. So I'm not ruining anything that is going to be visible. These are pieces that are going to be, or places that are going to be completely covered. And I keep going back into the different colors, adding a little bit more of the watercolor till I get the look that I want. To my right, off screen there, I have a piece of paper towel that I'm using to wipe any excess paint off my brush. I will often squeeze my brush to clear out any of the paint on the brush in order to have a clean brush to work with my next color. The water brush that I'm using has water right in the handle, so I don't have to have a jar sitting on my desk. I can just use that paper towel to completely clean my brush, have it ready for the next one. I can also add just a little bit of water to my paint if it's not quite wet enough. And this is perfect for me because I tend to be a little bit of a klutz. And if I were to have an open jar of water on my desk, you could be sure that I would likely knock it over. So I'm going to create 2 different color palettes with the different mica powders here. And I just realized that I spoke wrong. There's 8 colors in this palette. I didn't use 2 of the colors when I was painting these. So for my first hummingbird, I used the green, fuchsia, and galaxy. And for my second hummingbird, I used plum, violet, and cyan. So we're going to have 2 different hummingbirds, and actually I really like this second one and the colors that came out of it. And as I was painting it, I figured this is the one that I was going to use. But in the end, I chose that first one because you'll see when I get to that point of the card, it just shows up so much better on my background. So as I mentioned before, these die cuts were done out of Spellbinders watercolor paper. Any watercolor paper would work. You could also use a mixed media paper, but you definitely want to use a paper that can handle the moisture from watercolor. You don't want to use anything that is not meant for watercolor or wet techniques because it just won't handle this very well. And as I'm coloring, I go in with different colors, wipe my brush off, and then I go in and I blend between the different colors to get a nice smooth transition. Because these watercolors were created by using gum arabic with mica powder, they tend to be a little bit thicker, especially when I first start using them, first add the water to them. They rehydrate really, really well. I have them in this little palette, and when I'm done, the water will just evaporate and they'll be good to go for my next project. So they last quite a while, and I can always just make some more paint with more of the mica powders and that gum arabic. Once I have my hummingbirds how I would like them to be, and I have the blending how I would like it to be, I can let these dry, and once they're dry, I can assemble them together. Now, as I'm working, I can add a little bit more water to the paint in my palette just to make it a little bit runnier and a little bit more blendable. And I can keep going back and forth, adding more. I can clean my brush off and take some away if I feel that I have a little bit too much. But I love the fact that these mica powders create such a beautiful sheen, and having the option of being able to paint them rather than just having a powder that I would have to stick down to say glue or something makes it so much more convenient. For the little beaks, I just used some black soot distress reinker, and I watercolored those beaks and then set them aside to dry as well. One thing I had forgotten when I was doing my original hummingbirds is I had die cut the dragonfly. I ended up not using it in the card because to me it was a little bit too distracting, but I wanted to see how it was going to look watercolored with these Chameleon Mica Powders as well. And I absolutely love how it turned out. So I'm definitely going to have to save this piece and use it for a future card. Once they are completely dried, I can take them off of my mat here. Now, normally I use a damp cloth to wipe down my grip mat when I'm done. What I ended up having to do was just run it under some warm water and use my fingers to massage the paint, and it just rehydrated that paint and had it wash off really, really well. So it did come completely clean. The black soot distress reinker did stain where I painted it in those areas, but the distress ink tends to stain that grip mat, so I'm not too worried about it. It still has a grip to it. But that Chameleon Mica Powder watercolor came off very, very easy. So I'm using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle to glue my pieces together. Any of the pieces that have parts that go on top of them, I'm gluing those pieces together first, and then I'm going to start assembling the bird. So there's two parts to each one of the wings that I'm assembling together. The bird has a little belly part, and then I'm attaching his tail to him. And then there's a little part that goes over his face. Now I have these painted in coordinating colors to what I painted the bodies. You could have them in contrasting colors as well, and that would work well. I wanted everything to coordinate well together, so I just made them so that they would work well and have the same colors. I'm going to do the same thing to the second bird. I'm completely assembling both birds. This way I can put it onto my card base and see exactly which one I prefer. And like I said before, the one that I'm not going to use, I'm going to keep it and use it in a future card. I love the shimmeriness of these Chameleon Mica Powders for this use, and they really, in my opinion, resemble how hummingbirds are nice and shimmery. So it's a beautiful medium to color those die cuts. By using this liquid glue, I can use exactly how much I need for each one of those die cuts. And if you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I like to just throw them under an acrylic block to hold everything in place while it dries. It keeps everything flat, makes sure that that glue has good contact, and I know that my paper isn't going to start to curl from that liquid glue. It doesn't happen all the time, but some papers don't necessarily love it, so it starts to curl a little bit. So with those body pieces done, I can start assembling the rest of the bird. So I'm putting the beak on first and then adding the different wings. I chose to add the front wing where I wanted it to go, let that sit for a few moments, and then I added the back wing. And I figured it was much easier to position it to see exactly where it made sense for it to go by doing it that way. And by using that liquid glue, I can tilt and move that wing till I have the right placement. And they don't necessarily need to be the exact placement for each bird. And you can see when you look at mine closely, they both have different wing placement, but it works totally perfect. So it's great that you have the opportunity to change it and adjust it to what works best for you. Whenever I'm creating things like this, especially birds, I like to use black enamel accents for the eyes. It gives it some nice shine. It's a really nice black, and it also is nice and glossy. For these hummingbirds, I'm also using that black enamel accents on the beak because it makes sense to me. So I'm going to let that completely dry to the side while I start to work on the other pieces from my card. And that enamel accents comes off really, really easily. You could see I got it on my hands while I was creating, but it comes off, it wipes off my hands just with a damp cloth. For the rest of the pieces, I've decided to just use distress ink to ink blend those colors. Like I said at the beginning, I had originally thought about using watercolors or distress reinkers to color these, and you absolutely could do that. But I thought by ink blending them, they would have a little bit different texture than watercoloring, and I wanted the hummingbird to be the highlight of the card and the flower to kind of be the secondary element. So I wanted it to be nice, but I didn't necessarily want it to compete with the hummingbird. Now you can see those leaf pieces that I have there. You'll see later, one of them is a petal. So these are ink blended wrong. This one right here that I'm working on right now is actually a petal for the flower. So if you have this set and you're using it, keep in mind that that is actually not a leaf. Even though it's a perfect shape for a leaf, it's not. And I ended up not using it at all, but I could have just tucked it behind the flower. That totally would have worked. But it was later on when I realized that I made my mistake, so I ended up die cutting another one and ink blending it. For those leaves, the colors that I was using for doing my ink blending was bundled sage, peeled paint, and forest moss. For the center of those flowers, I used wild honey and ripe persimmon. And then for my flowers, I'm using spun sugar, kitsch flamingo, and picked raspberry, one of my favorite combinations for florals. And I'm just making things a little bit darker towards the bases of both the leaves and my flowers. One of these flowers kind of has a center to it, or one of the flower pieces kind of has a center to it, so I will make it darker within that flower center. Because these die cuts layer together, they naturally have some beautiful dimension to them, and I love how easy it is to create that dimension. I'm using a combination of regular ink blending brushes as well as some larger flat ones for the florals because it makes it a lot easier to do ink blending in larger areas. And I'm also going to use those flat ones for doing the background of my card because, like I said, it makes it so easy to do a large area and I don't have to worry about getting brush strokes because of the large flat topped ink blending tool. Now these pieces were all die cut out of watercolor cardstock, so they do take the ink a little bit different than just regular cardstock for ink blending. The ink tends to stick on the surface, so you do need to wait a few minutes for it to dry, and if you don't, you tend to get your fingerprint in there because it starts to try to remove that ink. So just keep in mind, you can ink blend on watercolor paper, but the ink sits on the surface, so you want to make sure that you let it dry for a few minutes before you start touching them. So this is where I was putting my flowers together, and this is where I realized that the leaf part that I had was actually a petal. So I will create another one in a moment, but I decided to just do a little bit of assembly in the meantime so that that could sit and dry while I ink blended that last petal. One of these pieces here is the base of this lily, so I'm going to glue that on there. Now you could add the petals or the buds that I have on this other piece to the right here. You could add that with the stem of the lily, or I chose to leave it separate and tuck it into the upper part of the lily and have it a little bit higher. Since I'm going to do this on an A2 card, I wanted there to be an element that was a little bit higher to the right side of my card, and I chose to do those petals or those buds there. Couple of those oval pieces that I was doing the ink blending on are for these, so it creates some natural dimension on there by gluing those together. So off screen, I die cut that leaf that I thought was a petal with that watercolor cardstock again. I'm going to use the same colors to do my ink blending. I'm just doing it super, super quick. I use the same colors, obviously, and just putting the darker colors toward the base of the petal. And then rather than let it dry, I end up just gluing it right to my flower right away. You do need to be careful, like I said before, because the ink stays on the surface, you want to make sure that you're not touching it too much where you don't want to see those fingerprints. You could always, if you happen to see a fingerprint on there, you can use your ink blending tool lightly and re-ink on there just to get the solid ink on there, but you couldn't really see it too much from when I was doing it. So this is my card background here. This is a piece that is 4 inches by 5 1/4. So there is going to be a little bit of a frame around it when I put it onto my card base. I'm using some tumbled glass as well as peeled paint ink here. And typically when I'm ink blending my background, if I'm using more than one color, or if I'm using blue at the top and green at the bottom, I will typically do, say, the green a quarter way up and the rest of it blue. But because I want to have my lily in the bottom right corner, I decided to do it on a little bit of an angle and have that green going up farther on the right side of that edge than it is on the left side. It just gives it a little bit of a unique look to it, and it works well when we get everything laid together with that hummingbird. Off screen as well as on screen, I'm making sure to wipe off my background because I'm doing ink blending on there. I want to make sure that I don't accidentally get any ink on my card base or get it on any other pieces where I don't want that ink. So now that I have all my pieces ready, I can start assembling my card together. I have a card base here ready to go, using that same glue that I've been using for assembling my die cuts to glue all of those pieces on. And because all of my die cut pieces are assembled already, they're good to go, and it makes putting the card together really quick and really easily. So I glued down that lily in the bottom right corner, and I was going to put a leaf down below there, and then I changed my mind and decided to add the leaf to where I put my buds, so I have those leaves at the top. What I didn't think about until I was doing this voiceover is I should have taken that leaf that I accidentally thought was a leaf and it was a petal, and I should have just put it at the bottom of the card. And I mentioned that earlier, and I didn't do that. This is where I'm trying to decide which hummingbird I was going to use, and this is the one that I was going to use, but you can see how the other one just pops off that background so much better. So I end up choosing to use that one. That means I have an embellishment all ready to go for another card. And you could see when I was creating those hummingbirds, creating 2 didn't take much more time than creating 1. So it's a great way to get extra pieces by creating multiples at the same time. Now, even though I've already chosen which hummingbird I want on here, I'm not going to glue it down yet because those black enamel accents aren't dry yet. And I know myself well enough to know that if I glue it down now, I'm going to put my hand in the wet enamel accents. And rather than doing that, I thought I'd add some detail to that lily. So I just took a white Signo gel pen and just added some dots in the center of it. It just adds some beautiful detail. Another way you could do this would be to add some darker pink dots. I think that would look beautiful as well, but I didn't have one that I really liked the color of. Once that hummingbird was completely dry, I can put the glue on the back of that and glue that down completely, and then put my acrylic block on there to hold everything in place. And this is where I just laid down that that dragonfly just to see if it would work, and it would work, but because I really liked the holograph or the Chameleon Mica Powders on that hummingbird, I wanted that to be the focal point, and I kind of thought that that dragonfly took away from it a bit. So I opted to leave that off, and I'll save that for a future card. At this point, I realized I hadn't cut off the extra stem from the base of that flower, so I did that really, really quickly. And there we have our finished hummingbird card. I absolutely love the shimmer you get from those Chameleon Mica Powders, and I love the gorgeous florals as well, but they don't draw your attention away from that hummingbird. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.